Today, I'm going to move on to talk about the rise of Russian absolutism, which I'll kind of first talk about the early history of Russia, like going back to the Middle Ages, and then I'll kind of go up through like the Rurik Dynasty, and then of course the most famous dynasty, of course, that Peter the Great was part of behind me, was of course the Romanov Dynasty. So I'll kind of get into that today, talk about the background of Russia. Anyway, like I said, we're going to move on to talk about the rise of Russian absolutism, which I guess really starts with Ivan the Fourth, or Ivan the Terrible. You kind of see in that picture, who famously built St. Basils Cathedral. You see, which is of course in Moscow. I'm going to, of course, talk about some of the early background of Russia. Russia, by the way, started way back in medieval times. You can go back to like the 9th, 10th centuries overall, but that's about where the Russian state really begins. So 800, 900s CE or AD. I'll get into like what they call the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus was like early Russian states that kind of inhabited mostly like the Ukraine and also the western part of Russia at the time. And I'll kind of explain like the background, of the name Russia and where it came from. Russia itself, he'll kind of show you a picture of right here, was first settled by the Vikings, like a long time ago, like Scandinavian peoples that came out of Norway and Sweden. And so the name Russia basically means the land of the Rus, or some people say Rus. They'll say it that way as well. And you can see there's kind of a map on the right showing how the Vikings began to kind of explore in the different parts of Russia at the time, mostly about the Middle Ages. And they're called Rus, or I think another common name they were called too, the Vikings that went into Russia. They're called also Varangian. And you can see a lot of them came down a lot of the rivers of Russia to get into it. Like the main rivers they kind of explored were the Don, the Dnieper, the Volga River. They also eventually at one point reached the Black Sea, also the Aral Sea as well. And they think the Vikings, what they were trying to do is they were trying to link up with a lot of the trade throughout that region, the Black Sea with the Byzantine Empire. Then you got the Silk Road running, from Asia to the west as well. And so they began to settle there. They think over time what happened with the Vikings, they later merged with a lot of the Eastern European peoples that were there, like the Slavs. And so they kind of became like one people over time. But the Kievan Rus primarily starts in the Ukraine. Which you see Kiev right there, kind of to the west. It's kind of, I'll get to like kind of a controversy right now between the Ukraine and Russia. What's going to happen with that? I don't know. I don't really believe Russia's going to invade the Ukraine. I think it's just saber rattling or whatever. But yeah, Kiev, is the capital of Ukraine today and all. But yeah, Ukraine was kind of like little Russia. That's kind of where Russia gets started, like a long time ago and all that. But they were called the Rus for a reason. A lot of it had to do with their long ships, which I think the term Rus or Rus meant to like to row the long ships, and hence the name where later it was kind of derived from in all that. Now later, of course, I'll get to the Mongols. They kind of come into Russia and kind of upset things and all that. But I'll kind of go through and talk about some of the early rulers. Like they had Vladimir the Great was one of the I think early leaders that they have that come in later. But they say the first real leader that went into Russia was a chieftain of the Vikings named Rurik. Hence the name of the so-called Rurik Dynasty that ruled Russia throughout the Middle Ages. And a lot of the rulers that came in and took over Russia were either called the Grand Prince or a Grand Duke. And so Rurik first ruled over Kiev, and I think Novgorod, north of of Moscow and Kiev. And so he was really their first ruler you really hear about, who lived in the ninth century. And then there were a few other rulers too, like Oleg of Novgorod was like his brother-in-law. I think late 9th century. They also had Ascold and Dur, I think, were these two other rulers that kind of reigned afterwards. And actually, there was actually a female ruler they had early on named Olga of Kiev. So kind of some of those rulers right there. But the ruler that really becomes more famous for the Russians, really between, I guess, the 10th and 11th century, is that ruler kind of that little picture at the bottom right. That was Vladimir the Great, as they called him, or Vladimir the First. Ruled between like about 10th to 11th century, died about 1015 CE. And he's considered really to be one of the first major rulers that's really important in Russian history, because of the fact that he's the one that really got Russia to convert to Christianity, because they eventually adopted the Orthodox faith and all that, which is traditionally the main religion that's popular in Russia today overall. But the Russians, they weren't just influenced by religion like Christianity, but they also were influenced by a lot of the Byzantine Empire, which was to the south around the Black Sea, Turkey and Greece. Yeah, a lot of the Byzantine architecture, like you see at St. Basils Cathedral, like with the onion domes, the culture, language, of course, especially like the Greek language, led to the Russian language, or Cyrillic. And of course, besides religion, of course, the other thing. So later, the Russians are going to kind of come up with this idea under the Tsars that Moscow is like the third Rome, kind of equivalent to like Constantinople or Rome in Italy. And so that's something they'll kind of try to do by the end of the Middle Ages. Now, let me get into next. I want to talk about, of course, I was getting into discussing, the Mongols. The Mongols come into Russia around the 13th century. You get this thing where the Mongol Empire forms in the early 1200s in Mongolia. And it was founded by, Genghis Khan, who was one of their main leaders. And so from there, the Mongols took over China. They pushed westward towards like India and into the Persian Empire was, or Iran was, Iran, and into Iraq. I think at one point they reached like the Black Sea and maybe even the Mediterranean Sea. But you can see up there at the top, they actually at one point would push into Russia, as far as like close to, I guess, the Ukraine. I think there's a theory they even maybe got to Poland at one point, believe it or not, in Hungary. And so, yeah, the Mongols kind of wreak havoc throughout Russia. And there was a grandson of Genghis Khan named Batu Khan. He formed a khanate out of the principalities of Russia there, which became known as the Golden Horde, or Golden Horde Khanate. It's like this vassal state under the Mongols, but it was ruled by the Tatars. So the Tatars were these Turkish mercenaries that kind of merged with the Mongols, and they were used to kind of run that area. And later they called it, I think the term Golden Horde was a term which was derived from the fact that the Tatars lived in these tents that had kind of a golden looking color to them, on top of the fact that they had to pay them off. The Russians had to pay the Mongols basically to not attack them and all that. I know I think Kiev at one point refused to pay, and so they were destroyed by it or something like that. And that's why Moscow became more powerful later. But the Mongols, they'll control pretty much Russia for a long time, from like the 13th to like the 15th centuries. And I think they say the Mongols at one point wiped out half the population of Russia. after they took it over and all that. All right, I'm going to next get into, and I want to, of course, talk about some of the czars that come into Russia. One of the first major ones that you have is you get this ruler that comes in named Ivan III, known as the Great. He was a Russian prince who basically ruled over Moscow. Moscow starts to be really more important compared to Kiev. Ivan's important. He lived like mostly late 15th, 14th century, about 1505 when he ruled. And the reason why Ivan III is important is he's the one that really consolidates all the Russian lands into one large state. He even starts to free Russia from the Mongols, with that allowing Russia to become more independent at the time. He was also known, you can see there, he was one of the first to proclaim Russia as his third Rome because of the influence of the Byzantine Empire, which, by the way, it folded, right before that, I guess. And so, yeah, he did things like he renovated the Kremlin, which, the Kremlin is where a lot of the Russian rulers would, of course, rule from in Russia. He adopted the so-called double-headed eagle, which is something that the Romanov Dynasty later uses. A lot of nations in Europe used the double-headed eagle. You know about that. I think Germany used it, and so did Austria and all that. And of course, he also was one of the first to start using the title Tsar. It was really an unofficial title that evolved from the term or title Caesar, which the Romans and the Byzantine Empire had used before. And so he's kind of trying to show that there's some kind of lineage with his dynasty, the Rurik dynasty, and the Romans and all that, the Byzantine Empire, etc. Ivan, by the way, is the second longest reigning Russian ruler. This is, of course, the first is Ivan the Terrible, who we'll get to. Ivan IV, of course, reigned 54 years. Just kind of give you an idea how long, of course, he reigned overall. There are some images, of course, of the Kremlin. You can see that's the Grand Kremlin Palace that's kind of in the middle. You can see how it's kind of fortified. So he helped to kind of, basically renovate that, and that starts to kind of become the capital, of Russia for at that time. Later, of course, it'll be moved to St. Petersburg and all that. There's the Grand Kremlin Palace right there. That's actually the residency of the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Basically, you're looking at right there. Now they have Ivan the Fourth, who of course is known as the Terrible. Ivan, of course, if you know about him, would eventually become the first official Tsar of Russia. He'll be crowned, by the way, on 1547. Ivan was, by the way, one of the most absolute of the Russian monarchs. I told you he reigned like something like 43 years was how long he was in power. Longest reigning ruler, I guess any kind of ruler of Russia overall. He does begin, of course, a new period in Russian history. They often call it the Tsardom of Russia, when, of course, the rulers of Russia reigned officially with the title Tsar, which goes from 1547 to 1721. Peter the Great would later adopt the title Emperor. And so from there, 1721 up to 1917, the rulers of Russia would go by the title Emperor and also Tsar as well. Now, you wonder about the name. Of course, the Terrible was more like a nickname that didn't really mean that he was a terrible person, which maybe kind of was, because the way he kind of maybe treated the Russian people somewhat. But the name Terrible, which is from the word Grozny, really translates as meaning something like either in English, the formidable, the fearsome, or if you want to translate further, maybe even the awesome is what it also meant. It was more of a name that was supposed to strike fear in people, especially those that were enemies of Russia and things like that. In fact, there was an old saying about Ivan the Terrible that's well known. Some of the Mongols said, I think at one point, they said something like that Ivan the Terrible was born with two teeth, one to devour us, the Mongols, and the other to devour you, which they're talking about their own Russian people as well. Ivan, by the way, was known for his construction projects. Like he, of course, famously built St. Basils Cathedral in the Red Square in Moscow, kind of like one of the main famous churches of the Orthodox faith in Russia now today. It's very famous for its Byzantine architecture, with the famous colorful onion domes to it right there. Might be one of the most famous buildings probably ever built in Russia. Overall, it's very colorful, of course, in part of Red Square and all that today. Why did he build it? Suppose it was built to commemorate some of his military victories, because under Ivan the Terrible, they began to push the Mongols back further eastward, and it helped commemorate the capture of Kazan, it's called, which was a Mongol Tartar Khanate state that he crushed, along with a few others in the east. Under Ivan the Terrible, the Russians began to expand like into Siberia, beyond the Ural Mountains and things like that. He was notorious for a lot of genocide. There's this famous secret police force that he had, which was called the Oprichniki, that he had. They're called the Tsars Dogs, and he used them to basically control the state, hunt down any people that were kind of considered enemies of him. He didn't just go after people that are peasants, but nobility or boyars that were kind of seen as a threat to him overall. And so, he is known for committing mass genocide. That's one thing they always talk about. He's kind of been compared with Stalin later, in the Soviet Union. And it peaked with the Novgorod massacre in 1570, where some people up in the northwestern part of Russia, I think they were kind of suspected of being aligned with the Poles, like Poland, Lithuania, I believe it was. And he sent in the Oprichniki, and supposedly they may have massacred as many as 30,000 people, or maybe it depends. They're not sure exactly if those numbers are accurate or not, but at the most, it may have been that. But they were called the Tsars Dogs because of the fact that they would actually ride around with these images of a dog, I think, on them or something like that. I want to say on their collar or whatever. They wore robes, almost like monks or something like that. And they actually carried brooms with them to sweep away the enemies of the state and things like that. That's kind of an image of the Oprichniki, which he later broke it up, the Oprichniki. But it's something that they always talk about that's kind of famous about his reign and power. Anyway, he's known for political oppression, in Russia, which is something you see later under the Soviet Union overall. Now, later, the Rurik Dynasty would eventually decline, which I think it goes up to the late 16th century, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that his son and heir to the throne, which was Ivan Ivanovich, he actually killed his own son. He got in an argument with him, and he took his staff. As you kind of see in that picture there, he's kind of holding the staff. He struck him in the head and killed him. And so after that, I think the rulers that came later were not effective, and so Russia kind of struggled through a period for a bunch of years until effective rulers really came in. Hey, Abigail, what's going on this afternoon? She's joining us now. I'll kind of talk a little bit about what happens later, after the Rurik Dynasty goes out. You have the Romanov dynasty that comes in, but before that happens, you have what they call the time of troubles, which goes from about 1598 to 1613. And during that time, what occurs in Russia, there's a period of anarchy where Russia is mostly controlled by the boyars, which are the Russian nobility in the country. And I think there's a couple people that rule, like I know Boris Godunov was, I think at one point, one of the rulers that reigned as a czar. They're kind of like a non-Rurik czar that ruled over the state. There's like no major, czars that you really have. I think there's even a case where there's a bunch of like fake czars that try to come in. That I think it was the false Dimitris. If you or study about the false Dimitris, where these fake people came in trying to say that they were one of the sons of Ivan the Terrible, named Dmitri, that was dead. But that, of course, didn't pan out with that. But they get the Romanov dynasty that comes in on 1613. And the Russian nobility decides to put in this man named Michael Romanov, who was, I think, kind of like he was like a grandnephew through one of Ivan the Terrible's wives. I think Ivan had like something like 7 wives at one point. And so they elected him in 1613. And so that started the whole Romanov dynasty, which will stay in power in Russia till 1917. So one of the most famous dynasties of Russia that's around for over 300 years at one point. He's not as famous, Michael or Michael the First. They have Alexis Romanov, who you see in that picture right there. He's really the second ruler of the Romanov dynasty, but really the one that they say will really turn Russia into more of an absolute state. He reigned from 1645 to 1676. And part of what happened under him was that he began to take power away from the nobility. And the nobility had this kind of an assembly they had called the Assembly of the Nobles. He actually got rid of it. He abolished it. And so after that, the czars ruled with more authoritarianism. And he also had a lot of power over the Orthodox Church in the country as well. By the way, the nobility only made up like 1% to 2% of the Russian population. That's about right. But especially up to like World War I know close to 2 million noblemen were actually in the Romanov dynasty, I think it was, whatever. But most people in Russia were peasants, especially serfs, if you know about that, of course, in Russian history overall. Tsar Alexis had 3 sons later that were czars. At one point, you had Fyodor III, who reigned for just like maybe around 6 years. Ivan V and Peter I came in. They were Fyodor III and Ivan V were kind of together. And then Peter I was like a half brother of theirs. Ivan V and Peter I would reign together as co-ruler czars, which they did for about 14 years. But Ivan was actually the older one, but he had physical, mental problems, and so he didn't really do much. And Peter later becomes the main ruler overall. That's what I want to get to next, of course, and talk. There's the double-headed eagle, of course, of Russia. Still kind of often used in Russia, I guess, today. But I want to get into and talk about, of course, Peter the Great, of course, one of the greatest rulers, of course, in Russian history. Peter the Great reigned, his main year of reign was from 1682 to 1725. So he reigned quite a long time also as well. And at first when he came in, if you know about that, he had to co-rule with his brother, Ivan V, who's his half-brother, basically. And they had a sister, by the way, I did want to mention, who was named Sophia Alexeyevna. And she was, of course, the regent for about, I want to say, 7 years, because the two were too young to actually reign by themselves. And so she kind of retained power as almost like the real czar of the country and all that. And there's a story they always tell about how she made this special throne that the two brothers sat on. She cut a hole out in the back of it to basically tell them what to say to the Russian court. and all that. So she was kind of the ones pulling the strings and all that at that time. But eventually, Peter got rid of her and eventually took over the country after that. Peter was known for this thing that was called the Grand Embassy. You may have heard about it, which happened between 1697 to 1698. And that's when Peter basically decided to visit foreign countries that were in the West. He wanted to find more about what other countries, how they ran their countries, and trying to modernize their country and all that. And so he traveled to like a bunch of countries like Poland, Lithuania. He went to Austria. He went to England. He went to the Dutch Republic of the Netherlands. Later, I think he went to France a bunch of years later, but he traveled all these different countries in Europe. And he came back and he tried to westernize Russia into making it into like a major power to rival some of the countries like France, Britain, Austria, and all that at the time, of course, overall. They say he also wanted to kind of form some kind of alliance further, because they already had this alliance called the Holy League, which had formed against the Ottoman Empire. And he was trying to strengthen it because the Russians didn't like the Turks, and so that's something that was kind of going on at the same time. Now I'll kind of go through and talk about some of the different reforms that Peter the Great was kind of known for. First of all, one of the things he did when he came back, if you know about it, was he got the men to dress a certain way, like Western dress. So like how they were dressing in France and other countries in Europe, he tried to conform them to dress more like them. The women too, as well. Men, if you know about it, he forced them to cut off all their beards and shave their face. I think you could get away with it with a tax, but if you didn't pay a beard tax, they would shave your face. And I think there's images like that on the bottom right here where basically he's, cutting their beards off or whatever. So he had to be basically shaved. When he went to England, he discovered the potato. So he brought that back to Russia. So they started growing a lot of potatoes there. But it led to like increased serfdom, which serfdom was basically majority of the peasants. Was almost like in slavery in name throughout the country. Adopted the Julian calendar. That's another thing that they did too, because they got rid of the old Orthodox calendar they had. And then he also introduced things like culture, arts, newspapers, things like that to the country. And so, yeah, Peter the Great became this kind of like an enlightened despot. Was kind of what he was, kind of like Frederick the Great, in Prussia, or maybe also like Emperor Joseph II Austria and things like that. So he's kind of comparable to that overall. Of course, one of the big things he did, if you know about it, was Peter the Great was the one that modernized their military in Russia. So he brought in like superior weaponry that they could use to fight with correct muskets and cannons. He even brought in European military advisors, like various generals that could advise him on warfare. And I think there was even a case where he brought in, like, there was a guy named I think his name was Peter Gordon, who was brought in. I want to say he was Scottish or something like that. He was brought in to help them militarily. I think he had a lot of European friends that he kind of brought over and kind of helped develop the state and all that. And then, of course, the most famous thing he did, about in Russia today, he founded the Russian Navy, of course, in 1796. So that's one of his big things he was known for. Now, Russia, another thing that he wanted to do was he wanted to expand Russia like to warm seaports. That's one of the things that he had kind of a problem with. Like when he came into power, Russia didn't have any real seaports that they could use to trade with different countries on things like that. And so under him, one of the first things that he did was he seized the northern Black Sea coast, where Azov is, which was controlled by the Turks. And this took place during the Great Turkish War, the so-called Azov campaign. And it's one of his, I think, early successes that he has overall. But the thing, I guess, that's more famous is the war that he fought with Sweden against the King Charles XII of Sweden. It was the so-called Great Northern War, which was really considered to be one of Russia's first modern or first major European war that they really get in, where he gets to kind of use his new modernized armies to fight against enemies and all that. And Charles XII was this young king of Sweden who later decided to invade Russia, if you know about this. And of course, it didn't fare well. If you know, I think here's kind of a map showing you the route that he took. But at the time, Sweden was starting to take control of a good bit of the Baltic, like the northern part of Poland, part of where the Baltic states were controlled by Sweden. Anyway, in this war, the Russians used like scorched earth policies to fight off the Swedish invaders, which Russia has done this multiple times. I think against Napoleon's forces, and I think they even did it in World War II as well. Basically, destroy anything that the enemy can use, whether it's food, drink, shelter, any kind of weaponry they could use. They try to destroy it. What is in northern Ukraine at a battle called the Battle of Poltava, which I kind of an image right here. I think it's Poltava there. The Russian forces badly beat his army, the army of Charles XII. They got crushed at the battle, and they think that was kind of considered to be one of the declining factors that led to why the Swedish Empire began to kind of go down after that. They're around, the Swedes, I think, into like the eighth. They got up to I think up to the Napoleonic Wars. They're kind of around, They're not as powerful pretty much after the 18th century. They start kind of going down, and Russia starts to kind of take control more of the Baltic Sea. Those are kind of things that kind of happen, of course, because of that right there. Of course, now Peter, of course, you got the Peterhof right there that you're kind of looking at overall. Now, one of the things that Peter's going to, of course, be doing after that, he's going to use that basically to construct a new capital, which, of course, will later be St. Petersburg, which was founded in 1712. Of course, he was able to basically steal some of the land that was around the Baltic Sea, which I'm trying to think if that map shows it or not of where it is. I know it had its map up here. There it is, St. Petersburg, you see at the top there. But basically, St. Petersburg is a city that was built on the Gulf of Finland, which goes out into the Baltic Sea. And so that becomes the Russian capital, from 1712 to 1918. Now it's Moscow, as you know, but it's pretty much the capital of Russia up to World War I. Peter kind of envisioned, St. Petersburg as being this westernized city that he called, I think, the window on the west. And currently in Russia, St. Petersburg is like the second largest city outside of Moscow, with a population of about 5.4 million people living there today. It is kind of the cultural capital of Russia. Of course, a lot of tourists go there every year. I think I've read somewhere that the average amount, at least back in 2018, was about 15 million visit the city annual. Maybe after COVID, it declined. That's about how many people visited a year. But that's the nickname that he called it, Peter. He called it the so-called window on the west. Now, I'll show you that picture there. Where was it? Right here. Of course, that's the so-called Peterhof Palace, of course, which became famous. The Peterhof is a famous Baroque-style palace that was constructed later in his reign. It was built primarily in the early part of the 18th century. I think it opened, I want to say, in 1721, a few years before he died. And Peterhof means like Peter's court primarily, and so this was going to become like basically the center of his court, where he would reign from. And of course, some in Russia have called it the so-called Russian Versailles. The reason for that was because it was built kind of to rival what Louis XIV had built at Versailles. And so that's something he's kind of famous for. And it's one of several palaces that the Romanovs built, of course, later. Here's a more aerial view, of course, of the Peterhof. It is famous for having a lot of its mountains, which are kind of in the front, which I showed you in that little short video. And then you can see in the back, it's got a lot of gardens and parks, kind of like, Versailles had also as well. You see, it's a string of buildings which are kind of combined right there. It overlooks the, like an outlet into the Gulf of Finland. So I can kind of show you right there, that short little picture going out into the Gulf of Finland right there. He also built this fortress here, which was called the so-called Peter and Paul Fortress, named after St. Peter and St. Paul in the New Testament. And it was a kind of like a star-shaped citadel or fortress that was built there to guard the city. I guess in case Sweden invaded again, tried to attack them again, that kind of thing. And it later became notorious for being used as a political prison that was used by the Tsars. And then later, I think it was used by the Soviet Union early on, up to like the 1920s as well. And I think at one point, some of the early Tsars were actually buried in it at one point. And I think later, a lot of the Russian rulers are buried in the Kremlin now. And there, of course, is a very famous equestrian statue, of course, of Peter the Great. That's there in St. Petersburg. It was put there later by Catherine the Great. You're wondering about that statue. Now, I'm going to get into some of the later Tsars that you have overall. Of course, Peter would found what they, like I said, what they call the Russian Empire, which I told you starts in 1721. And it goes up to 1917. So he's the first emperor of Russia. But there's like at one point you see there's about 14 rulers that are considered emperors or empresses. So you had 10 emperors, and you had 4 women that reigned as empresses also as well. If you see to the far left, Catherine I, who reigned from 1725 to 27, she was actually the wife of Peter the Great. She reigned briefly for a few years, couple of years. Then you had Peter II. Peter II was the grandson of Peter the Great. He reigned for a few years. Then they have also Anna. You see there, Anna, of course, 1730 to 1740. Anna was a daughter of Ivan VI, of course, or Ivan, they called him. And so she basically reigned kind of ineffective rulers that are there. And then finally, they have Elizabeth, who reigns 1741 to 62. Now, she was more effective as a ruler. There's, of course, a picture of Empress Elizabeth on the left. She is known for, by the way, being the youngest daughter of Peter. I think one of the last direct descendants of the Romanovs. And she reigned for like around 21 years as the ruler, but she really didn't have any heirs, like any children. And so she had to give the throne to one of her nephews, who was actually German more, named Peter III, who came in afterwards as emperor, who was, by the way, unpopular. And so that would later allow Catherine the Great to eventually seize power, which I'll explain later. But Empress Elizabeth was actually kind of popular in Russia in the 18th century. And she was kind of important for several reasons. She actually continued the Enlightenment in Russia, like with art and culture. And she's primarily known for founding the University of Moscow in Russia today. And she also is the one that began construction of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, which is also one of the main palaces, of course, of Russia, too, that was in St. Petersburg. Now, I'm going to kind of move on to talk about one of the other main rulers, of course, of Russia that was well known. Of course, one of the greatest rulers in Russian history is Catherine the Great, who, by the way, is considered to be one of the greatest female rulers in Russian history, pretty much. And she wasn't just that. She was, if you know about it, known as an enlightened despot, which a lot of these, monarchs at the time believed in reforming the state. And so under Catherine the Great, she continued the westernization of Russia. She brought in more enlightened ideas, more art and culture, things like that. Founded more schools and other things like that as well. And the weird thing about her background was that she was not actually Russian. She was mostly German. I think she was kind of somehow, related to the Romanovs, like kind of indirectly, but she was mostly a German princess. Her real name wasn't Catherine. It's a name she adopted later, Katharina, when she, of course, came to Russia. But she went by the name Sophia Augusta, and she was from the state that was called Anhalt-Zerbst. And she ended up marrying a second cousin of her who was also German in 1744, which his name was Charles Peter Ulrich, or he was actually kind of from this German state called Ulstein. And that's the one up above I just showed you right here on the right, Peter III, as we're talking about, who was actually German and all that. And Peter actually would end up being unpopular. Basically, Elizabeth would die in 1762. He would take over the country, and none of the Russian people liked him. He was just too German. He was kind of unstable. Some people thought he was crazy. I think there's another rumor that he was also gay as well. Didn't really like women. I think there's even a deal where they think Catherine and him may not have even had consummated a marriage or anything like that. There's been theories about that as well. And so Catherine used that to basically overthrow him. And so she kind of conspired with the palace guard to basically overthrow him. And so I think Peter only reigned like 6 months as Tsar Emperor. And he was, I think, killed afterwards, they believe. So that started the so-called Katharina era, or as they call it usually. That's usually what they call it, the Katharina era, which becomes like this golden age of Russia that you have later, or if you want to call it the age of Catherine the Great, you can also call it that as well. We'll talk about some things that she's kind of known for, Catherine the Great. Of course, when she came in, she would, convert to the Orthodox faith. I think she was Protestant originally. You study about her when she was in Germany. She learned Russian. She took up a Russian name, etc. And kind of talk about some of the things that she's known for reform-wise. Well, like I said, she encouraged the westernization of the nobility in the country, brought in more art, more culture. He began to educate people by creating schools for men and women in the country. And I think our most famous thing that I think people talk about today about Catherine the Great is she's known for founding the State Hermitage Museum, which is part of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg today. And it's this art museum that she started in the 18th century that ended up becoming one of the largest museums in the world, with over 3 million of works of art in the world. Not just European art, but art from different kinds of civilizations like Roman, I think Egyptian, and so on. All kinds of famous painters too, that you can think of, Rembrandt, Picasso, etc., that are there. So it is considered one of the greatest, museums in the world today. There's another image of course, of the State Heritage Museum. So it's kind of started by her, and then over time it expanded over multiple centuries, of course, that it's been there in Russia. She's also known for founding this thing called the Smolny Institute. It was like this educational school, I think, for noble women. I think it's called Smolny Institute for Young Maidens, I think was the original name of it. And so it was set up to educate them. And so not just men could be educated, but women. But obviously it didn't include like people that were lower classes, that kind of thing. Now, there is one thing they always talk about her reign, which was kind of a challenge for her. And one of the things that she had been wanting to do, if you know about it, was to abolish serfdom. And they had this thing called the Puketup Rebellion, which broke out in the 1770s. It was led by this man named Emelian Pugachev. And the rebellion itself changed Russia forever, like for a long time, because she had been wanting to try and abolish serfdom in the country, but a lot of the nobility didn't want to do it because they relied a lot on the peasant serfs to kind of run the agricultural base of the country. And apparently this Ukrainian Cossack soldier named Emelian Pugachev started a rebellion. I want to say close to where the Volga River basin is, just kind of like in Western Russia, Ukraine. And anyway, he claimed to be the dead Tsar, Peter III, which he wasn't. He even set up his own government that was an alternative to her government. And so she had to actually send forces in there and put it down and crush it. And I think close to about, I want to say 10,000 people were killed in this uprising, which some people call it a rebellion, some people call it a revolt. I think it's kind of debated about that. But it is one of those things in her reign that kind of complicated things. And so they don't really end up abolishing serfdom until the 1860s. So it's much, much longer when that actually happens because of Emelian Pugachev. I think the years for it were 1773 to 1775. It was about right. Of course, one of her most famous successes as the leader of Russia, of course, was the expansionism of the country, which they did a lot under her reign. And under her, one of the things that they began to do, which is real famous if you know about it, is they expanded and took over a good chunk of Poland, which Russia controlled Poland for a long time. So you have the so-called partition of Poland, where Russia basically took over about 60% or almost 2/3 of the former Poland-Lithuanian state, which broke up in the late 18th century. She took over and seized control of the Ukraine and the Crimea. That southern part of the Ukraine was originally controlled by the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. They basically seized it by the 1780s and began colonizing it. So there's been a lot of Russian people living there in the southern part of the Ukraine and eastern part of the Ukraine going back to the 18th century. So I guess that's kind of why some Russians want control of that part of the Ukraine, because of the fact that you've got a lot of pro-Russian people pretty much live in that area. Also, Siberia, they colonized that, and then I think by the end of her reign, they were also, getting into Alaska as well. You can kind of see that area where Poland was partitioned, but see most of the eastern part of it. But yeah, you can see this map here, how Russia just expands, from pretty much west to east. You can see it kind of start in the western northern part of it. Then it starts pushing eastward, then beyond the Ural Mountains into Siberia, then all the way to the Kamchatka, peninsula that you see right there on the eastern side of it by the 1700s. And Russia itself you know about the territory of it today, it peaked at like almost like 9 million square miles. Or if you want the kilometers, it's 23 million square kilometers. Was how large of an area that they controlled at one point. It is still one of the largest countries in the world, like the actual landmass that they control, Russia. And at one point, they had one of the largest empires in the world. I think the only two that were, came close to it, later, or really around that time, was the Mongols. The Mongols, I think, at one point had the second largest empire in the world. And then the British Empire, of course, I want to say up to like the early 20th century, had the largest empire, overall, which was stretched, all over the world at one point. So yeah, it's kind of like, the size of Russia today still is that big. I think parts may have shrunk, after the Soviet Union broke up, but it's still pretty large overall. Catherine, by the way, was notorious. I don't know if you know about this, but she was known for having a lot of lovers, which has been kind of a debate about how many lovers that Catherine the Great had. I think I've seen anywhere from 21 to 22 at the most. She was known for being supposedly a nymphomaniac. She liked sex a lot, and she had many different lovers. There's even a rumor that she had some kind of special kind of erotic cabinet that she built, which may have had sex toys in it or something like that. There's an urban legend about her that she died making love to a horse, like to a stallion. They think it's just a made-up story. They think she actually died of a stroke. Yeah. I think her most famous lover was Grigory Potemkin. You may have heard of him. He was a Russian general and statesman in Russia under her reign. That was supposedly her court favorite. That was very well known at the time. Let me also look at here too. I want to kind of just for a few minutes, I'm almost finished today with this lecture, but I want to talk about some of the later monarchs. Some of these we'll kind of talk about later that we'll have overall. Yeah, after her death, there was a bunch of other rulers that came in later that you have. You've got, they had her son reign next, which was Paul. Paul reigned from, Emperor Paul I reigned from 1796 to 1801. There's been a debate about whether Paul was actually related to Catherine and Peter III. I think there's some speculation that Catherine may have actually, there may have been another father, of Paul. It's kind of debate about. We don't know yet if that's really true or not. But anyway, he was only in power for like 5 years, and then Emperor Alexander I reigned from 1801 to 1825. He's probably more famous as the grandson of Catherine the Great. And he's later famous for fighting Napoleon. Napoleon will later invade Russia, if you know about this, in 1812. And he kind of uses, scorched earth policies to defeat Napoleon's Grand Army. And Alexander is one of the main, major monarchs in Europe that defeats Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars. Like he even marches on and takes Paris in 1814 and all that. Then you got the four on the right there. Those are some of the later Russian emperors that were well known. Nicholas I, 1825 to 1855. He's kind of famous later for, I know, starting like the Crimean War, where France, Britain, and the Ottoman Empire fought Russia. It's one of the major conflicts that they think leads to the decline of Russia in the 19th century. Then he had a son named Alexander II. He was later called, if you know about this, the Tsar Liberator. He was the one that in 1861 freed all the serfs. He's kind of like the Russia's Abraham Lincoln and all that. And so he was considered one of the very few czars in the 19th century that was kind of pro-reform minded, because most of them were kind of like hardliners that kind of wanted to continue the absolute policies of pretty much the Romanov Dynasty. Alexander III was kind of this reactionary czar, by the way, to Alexander II, but he was known as the peacemaker. He was the ruler of Russia from 1881 to 1894. And Alexander III was kind of instrumental in creating peace between Russia and France, which will later be important, in World War One when they got to fight Germany and all that. And so, and then of course the last one on the far right, you have Nicholas II. He's the last Tsar of Russia, last emperor that they have, who reigns till 1917. And of course, I'll get to him later. Of course, Nicholas II, he ends up getting overthrown, of course, due to the Russian Revolution that happens in 1917. So we'll get more into that later. Of course, we'll have, the Soviet Union take over. We have this, the so-called Russian Revolution, Russian Civil War. They have, and so Russia, ends up being created into like a communist, socialist type state that'll be around throughout the Cold War. So Russia's gone through a lot of turbulent period. It's part of why I think their population hasn't increased like it should have, over time, because of all these conflicts where a lot of people died. I know in World War II, they lost like 20, 30 million people were killed, of course, in the war. Now, I think Russia today is trying to become continue its, role as a world power in the Cold War, the Soviet Union. I guess that's what Vladimir Putin wants as president of Russia. Now, whether he invades the Ukraine, I don't know about that. I think that's all, like I said, saber rattling, with, geopolitical tensions, mostly over probably oil and gas in that region. There's a lot of pipelines, running from Russia, Ukraine, and into Europe that are kind of important. Now, I doubt we'll have a war over that. I seriously doubt it. But anyway, so that's it for today. Did want to talk about a few reminders, though, before I go. Don't forget, I do have a bunch of assignments that are out, of course, that are out there. I told you about the Reformation quiz is going to close today. I'll send out reminders about it, of course, about those assignments. Of course, we have a world exploration quiz that's open right now. That's going to be due like in a bunch of days. I'll probably extend that one for you. Conquest of America quiz will be due next week. Y'all do have vocab coming up. So I don't know if some of you, I think, have maybe started to work on that and turn it in. But I know starting Friday, you can start turning in your vocab that you have. But I am going to post the first exam probably Friday, which is going to be on absolutism. I think I'm just going to have it on that. It's going to be a simple, long quiz. That's all it's going to be, pretty much. So that's it pretty much for today. But I'll send out, reminders later in the week about various things about the class that I've got kind of going on. That wraps up pretty much my lecture series on the age of absolutism, of course, which will go towards, like I said, the first exam. So don't look like I had any questions right now. I know it looked like Trey was joining us, I think, earlier than Diamond. Hey, what's going on? Hope y'all have a great week overall. But that's it, pretty much live lectures for this week. I might have a recorded lecture coming up later. I might have, which might be on the Age of Enlightenment or something like that. But I know next week I'm primarily going to move on to talk about the rise of the British Empire and all that. So that's it for today. Yeah, there is a study guide. Just go. It should be in modules. And of course, the discussion questions are in discussions about that going on right now. Don't forget about discussion questions. Of course, I've got going on right now. I think the Conquest of America, I think, is the main one. I guess y'all still working on. So y'all take care. And if you have any questions about the class, just email me. Y'all got pretty much my email and all that. So y'all take care and have a good weekend coming up later. So I'll see y'all later.